weekly Hempology 101 lecture put on by the International Hempology 101 Society and the UBSS Hempology 101 Club. Today's lecture is the first time we've done a lecture on cannabis activism. We cut out a lecture out of last year's series. I think I did two that were closely related, families in the drug war and the social impact of prohibition. So kind of squeeze that together so we only have one class on the effects of prohibition now. But that has allowed me room for this other class on cannabis activism, which I think is important in many ways, both to document what has been done, both in terms of giving us a sense of history as a community of activists, and also to help maybe inspire or give people a few ideas about what they may be able to do as well. So I guess I started this week's PowerPoint presentation with this rather, in some ways, funny yet not so funny character of Uncle Sam, as the United States is often known as. And in a way, it just, I guess, starts off with, for me, pointing out a number of things that from the very beginning, everyone has essentially paid for the war on drugs, whether it's, through taxes or a loss of human rights or loss of access to medical treatment that could have been available if plant-based medicines had been embraced in the past century in particular. And really dating back, if you go back to prohibition, further than that religiously, obviously, there's been many victims of the war on drugs, but I would have to say, just generally, again, through loss of rights and just social costs, everyone has paid for, and certainly many of us have suffered more than most. Can you switch through easily? Or are you through? Holy cow.
It's funny that you can find posters on the stand.
Yeah, cannabis activism. There weren't really many activists when the laws were first brought into effect throughout North America and the world. What we saw were people getting arrested. Predominantly black people originally were the primary focus, although Mexicans and poor white people were usually the initial targets. Although that changed over time. One of the things that gradually or that really influenced people throughout the 60s was the Vietnam War. And there's people getting arrested for all sorts of things back then. And so if you look back into the 60s, there isn't a lot of per se cannabis activism, but lots of freedom kind of fighters, you could say, were helping to make changes. What isn't so well known about is even the resistance within the U.S. Army. And Dr. Grinspoon points out in I think Marijuana Reconsidered, that one of the primary factors in withdrawing from the Vietnam War was even the rebellion within the troops in Vietnam. There's been famous footage out there of soldiers giving shotguns, like platoon leaders blowing cannabis smoke through the gun barrels to the other members of the platoon, and it was seen very much as being a political statement against the war, and something that the soldiers very well knew would not make them as good of fighters as the government wanted them to be, but they were drafted. They had no choice but to be there, so a lot of them picked up the habit then, and honestly, it was through the army in many ways that the use of cannabis was even brought to North America in the first place, through sailors who sailed around the world and had been to Africa and Asia and tried hashish and all these other various products, right? Like, so, that when you think, the original prohibitions against the Mexicans, well, the Mexicans are the sort of, that lived here indigenously didn't really have cannabis before that. It was brought here by the Spanish and their soldiers in particular, right? So, the use of these intoxicants has had a long historical use within the armies and navies of the world, but it was really, again, through the Vietnam War that a lot of middle-class Americans in particular were exposed to it, and in a sense, when they came back often injured, they became radicalized a bit. And so there's a number of factors that obviously, if you know any sense of history from the 60s, where people were getting arrested and killed or killed at protests in universities and all sorts of things, that people started to organize more and more, just and because of the sheer number of people that were being arrested and all the rights and privileges that were and still are lost as a result of being arrested. So,
Next one, Jack, here.
yeah. So actually, well, I guess we'll leave it. May as well switch to Jack. I want to talk about him for a minute, but sure, switch it over and then you can go back.
Right here.
Well, what you got to do, you take the cursor right over.
Put this on, so I have to work it for the other thing.
That one, I can still do that. Okay, go all the way over to there, and then you click it once. That didn't work. There.
There we go.
Okay. Then bring it back, and you can do that. Okay. So in the handouts today, there's a story kind of on the back that I wanted to touch on. There's so many things to talk about and learn from, but I want to, again, give us a sense of history of the movement and at times why we've stumbled even. Normal formed in 1970, Keith Stroke, I think is how you say his name, and a number of lawyers focused on Washington, D.C., and were able to get money from a whole bunch of basically drug smugglers from across North America that wanted to see change happen, right? Which is kind of, in some sense, ironic. You'd think people making a lot of money off the trade being illegal would want to keep it that way, but there are a lot of individuals who would want to see it legalized and pay their taxes and everything, if at all possible. And Normal was started up by those like-minded individuals who kind of got together and decided that we needed lawyers, right? So Keith and his group was very successful. A number of other things were happening in the United States as well, and so there was, I think, 13 different states in the mid-70s that actually passed pretty much decriminalization laws. Some of them survived even, I think, into the late 1990s. Alaska had laws which allowed you to possess, really, fairly sizable quantities and to grow your own. But eventually these laws were all overturned in one way or another. But the real pivot point, unfortunately, in some sense, isn't very well known about it. Now that I think about it, I realize I forgot to bring my one book. I think it's called High in America, The Story of Normal. I'm sure I can quote it at that. Pardon?
That's what it is in your...
That's what it is there in the bibliography, yeah. It's a really interesting book, that, and it helps kind of show where, big mistakes can have long-term impacts. Because there's certainly Normal pushing for the legalization of cannabis, but back then in the 60s and 70s there was a lot of poly drug users, right, and a lot of resistance to prohibition. But first and foremost, the push was towards legalizing cannabis, and the theory was the rest would become legal later. Unfortunately, for many reasons, I say that cocaine was also quite widely used amongst, in particular, the wealthy and the elite. It wasn't, the harms from it weren't really as apparent as they are today. And so apparently at the 5th anniversary of Normal, they had a great big party in Washington, D.C., their biggest ever, tons of media, all sorts of important individuals, including Jimmy Carter.